Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Thank you for being on this podcast today. And I am really delighted to introduce to you somebody whose work has fascinated me, not just in the recent years, but for decades. And I've always wondered, what is the first thing I'm going to ask this man if I ever got him on my podcast? And the answer was, I'm going to talk to him about why power is such a bad word and yet it is so important in organizations, at least according to his research. But to give you a little bit more about this man's biography, Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer, who is my guest today, actually started his career after a degree in Carnegie Mellon, where he wanted to study management, and then decided to work for the government during the Vietnam War, didn't quite enjoy it, decided to go back and do his PhD, and then got into academics. And boy, what a career that has been. I can't wait to talk to him. So let's get going. Professor Pfeffer, it's such a delight to have you on the podcast. Thank you for being here.
And it's an honor to meet you.
Thank you so much. I want to, of course, start by asking you a question that I always wanted to, as I said during the introduction. People are always told that it's not nice to be chasing power, and yet you've shown in your research and your books, my favorite one being, of course, the 7 laws of power. I'm going to come to that in greater detail. Why do we have this love-hate relationship with power? We need it, we want it, yet we don't want to tell people we want it. Why is that?
Well, I think we are socialized by both our religion and our families to be modest and to believe that the world is a just and fair place, and that if you work hard and do a good job, everything will work out. And so if you plot too much, or if you're too strategic about your career, this seems to be inconsistent with these teachings that say, you need to be just in the background and good things will happen to you. Good things will come to those who wait. So on the one hand, every religion, of course, has a power hierarchy, which is true, most religions at least. And it's certainly true that if you're going to achieve the Stanford Business School motto, which is change lives, change organizations, change the world, you're going to need power. Because if change were going to happen without the exercise of power and influence, it would have occurred already.
When people start their career, do they need more of it, or do they need more of it when they reach the top?
You need more of it always, but, if your career is going to advance, you certainly need influence, and you certainly need people in power to want to sponsor you. Many people in their careers look for mentors. Mentors give advice. You don't need mentors. You need sponsors. Sponsors give you promotions. Mentors give you advice. Advice is cheap. Promotions are dear.
Do some people find it easier to wield power? Is that an individual trait, or is this something which is learned behavior? Are we born with it?
I think you can learn this behavior. If I didn't believe you could learn it, I certainly wouldn't be in the business of teaching it. And I have seen people transform themselves in both the online version of my class called Building Power to Lead, and the class I teach at Stanford called The Path to Power. You see people over a relatively short time really transformed. And they are transformed in several ways. Number one, their ambition is greater. Number two, their expectations of themselves are greater. And number three, they begin to practice what they kind of knew they should have been doing, but were reluctant to do as you began your discussion. So I basically give people the freedom to do what they know they should do, but somehow felt inhibited from doing.
So you just give them permission through your class. So let's get going with a mini version of the class. I'd love to talk to you about the 7 laws of power. And
this had 7 rules of power.
7
don't,
rules.
Don't get me confused with the 48 laws of power. 48 is too high a number. 7 you can actually remember.
What is the first rule?
Get out of your own way. And you already alluded to that. People come into the world with ideas about themselves and what they are willing and unwilling to do. And so we inhibit ourselves. Number one, many people suffer from what is called imposter syndrome. The idea that they aren't as good as they actually are, that they don't deserve to be in a position of power, responsibility, that there are other people more qualified than them, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to lose descriptions of yourself that in any way hold you back or disempower you. Number two, people come into this world, or they're trained by their religions or by their families to want to be liked, you want to be popular, you want to get good grades for your teachers by being a good student and following the rules, etc. And, in the words of my friend Gary Loveman, who used to run Caesars, the large casino company, if you want to be like a dog will love you unconditionally. Your job as a senior leader is not to be liked, it's to make things happen. And regardless of, how participative you are, how thoughtful you are, not everybody's going to like what you do, so you got to get over that. So I think that's the second way in which we get in our own way. So, you want to lose this idea of imposter syndrome. You want to get over the idea of being liked. And I think we are all socialized to conform to role expectations, sometimes based on gender, sometimes based on race or ethnicity. And once again, I do not think you should let other people and their expectations define you. The most successful and powerful people I know, of course, defy those social conventions and social norms. So the first rule, and the most important rule, is get out of your own way. If you don't get out of your own way, you're never going to go anywhere.
And that in your book, you also talk about the way you introduce yourself and say, oh, I don't deserve to be here, but so many smart people. Those are some of the examples that you've written in your book. And so I absolutely recommend everyone should certainly read the book. Thank you. That is the first one. What is the second law of power?
Second rule is to break the rules. No company succeeds by doing what everybody else does. And no person, I think, succeeds by doing what everybody else does. In the words of one of my friends, who made the damn rules in the first place. So we have rules and social conventions about, all kinds of them. You accomplish big things only by getting not only out of your own way, which is rule one, but rule two, by being willing to defy the rules, by willing to do things that other people are not willing to do. So in the case of strategy, Southwest Airlines defies the conventional wisdom of the hub and spoke system. Whole Foods Market's a large grocery chain now owned by Amazon, defies the rules that you want to minimize costs of your goods, the product in your stores. My friend George Zimmer ran for many years the off-price tailored men's clothing chain, Men's Warehouse. Normally, retailers place all the emphasis on the purchasing. George had the obvious insight. He said, you only make money when you sell it, not when you buy it. And so he emphasized store operations. So in strategy, I think you want to break with conventional wisdom. I think you want to break with conventional wisdom in your career as well. The idea that you want to be modest and not tell people about what you're accomplishing and hope somehow that they learn it on their own. Maybe they will, but your boss has other things on their mind besides you. So maybe you should break with that. I think you need in general to be bolder than most people are. You need to take more chances. You need to take more risk. In finance, of course, there is a trade-off between risk and return. I think that trade-off exists in careers as well. If you just keep your head down and don't do very much to stand out, then no one will notice you. And the one thing I can assure you of is that nobody has ever hired or promoted somebody that they could not remember. So you need to do some things to differentiate yourself. To use the Michael Porter phrase in strategy, we talk about a strategy of differentiation. You have to differentiate yourself in these large organizations as well, where you may be one of, hundreds of McKinsey consultants or people working for JP Morgan Chase or whatever the company is that you're working for. You need to do something to differentiate yourself. And that involves basically breaking with social norms and conventions.
Perfect. So therefore, the importance of a personal brand also at some stage, we'll talk about that. What's the next rule?
The next rule is to act and speak with power. I think there's a saying, which I think is true, I've been able to find the source for it, that you are perceived about 50% by how you appear, your body language, your physical appearance, your height, how you come across, how you present yourself, 40% by how you sound, and by only 10% by the content of what you say. So you need to show up, you need to act and present yourself in a powerful way. And if you look at powerful figures in history, I think you see that they have a command presence. Not that he's somebody that you necessarily want to model yourself after in all respects, but Benito Mussolini, according to this book on history, spent hours on his rise to power practicing his speeches in front of a mirror. Because he was short, he wanted to come across with command presence, so he practiced his speaking, his talk. My colleague Dana Carney at the University of California, Berkeley, is writing a book on body language, and this is something that everyone can learn. You can learn to adopt a more expansive posture. You can watch Amy Cuddy's TED Talk
Yeah.
called presence. So this is all consistent with the idea that how you show up matters.
And do some communities adopt this power posture, or is this, something which anyone can pick up?
I'm sure it comes more naturally to some people rather than others, but this is, again, a skill that can be learned. Think about it, great actors. If I say to you, I want you to play Julius Caesar, or I want you to play General Patton, you weren't born as an actor, but you learn acting skills, and you can learn to act in a powerful fashion or to play a character who's projecting power. So you can learn this in your own life as well.
What is the next rule of power?
Build a brand. Build a powerful brand. If I said to you, you want to build, Coca-Cola wants to build a brand, or Tesla wants to build a brand, or United Airlines wants to build a brand, this comes naturally. A brand is, of course, what you stand for. It's a short description of who you are and what you're about and how your life experience and training has made you uniquely suited for the job you either are doing or the job that you want to hold. So yes, I think you need to build a brand. Martha Stewart has built a fabulous brand, which in spite of the fact that at one point she served time in jail, has never been worth more. You think about Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, or Steve Jobs particularly. These were all people who built a brand. It did not come naturally. Regis McKenna, the public relations executive who actually made Steve Jobs, will tell you that when Steve Jobs began his career, he could hardly give a speech, let alone to become the charismatic, effective speaker that he later was. This is a skill that can be learned. You build a brand, and I think Jobs and his brand that he built at Apple about being different and being unconventional, which was true for him, true for the company, true for the products, I think was a brand that served him very well.
If you're starting off in your career, how do you build a brand?
Well, you get advice from other people, but the first thing you do is you try to write 1 or 2 or 3 sentences that describes who you are, and not a resume. You are not just a resume about your set of education and experiences. Who are you? What do you stand for? I had a student in my class, an African-American physician. He had not talked much during the class, but in the class on brand building, we randomly called on him. And he said, I'm a Black physician. I came from a very poor part of a very disadvantaged city. I'm getting my MBA. I've already gotten my MD. And my career is going to be focused on improving the health of these underserved minorities. And there's a brand. It's a brand that connects to his life experience as a Black man. It's a brand that connects to his education as both a doctor and an MBA. And it connects him in a way that says, I am somebody who's serious about trying to fix the problems of the inequities in healthcare, particularly for minority communities. Simple, connects with him, connects with who he is, connects with his skills, provides a brand that people then related to him for the whole rest of the class in a very different way.
And does that change the way that you describe your personal brand as you become more experienced in your career or at a senior position? How would the same person describe himself or herself differently?
I'm not sure that they ever do. My friend Keith Ferrazzi, who wrote the book Never Eat Alone, or John Levy, who wrote the book You're Invited, which is a fabulous book, which I highly recommend. I think they see themselves as basically people who connect other people and who build useful connections. And I don't think that's changed as they've gotten more successful. I don't think Elon Musk's brand as a, technological visionary and an unconventional thinker changes. If you've got a brand that really represents who you are, that is not probably going to change very much.
To what extent is this personal brand something which is entirely 100% accurately descriptive of you, and how much of that is, showmanship and put on and just sort of attention-seeking behavior?
It's the same thing as for a company. Every organization claims, every airline claims that they're the best airline. I don't think that can possibly be true. So obviously you want to emphasize the more positive aspects, but you also want to emphasize aspects of your persona that are consistent with fundamentally who you are and make sense of who you are. I think a little embellishment is fine. Too much probably gets you into trouble.
What is the 5th rule of power?
Network relentlessly. It's interesting. Leadership is often defined as getting things done through other people. If leadership is getting things done through other people, the more other people you know, the easier you're going to find it to get things done. So you need to build tons of relationships, including people who are different from you, so you get access to different knowledge and different social circles. So it is important to network, and you can never have too many social contacts. And you can never tell where the help is going to come from. It may come in all kinds of surprising ways and from surprising places.
Does that matter more when you are self-employed, or does it matter more when you are employed in an organization? Or
that I think everybody needs to network, and most people do not spend enough time networking. If you're not spending 6 to 8 hours a week networking, building relationships, you're probably underinvesting in your social ties.
So introverts typically find it harder to reach out to people. They are more, shy, they hesitate. What is your advice to them?
I think networking is oftentimes seen as too self-seeking or self-interested. And an effective networker is a person with generosity who's saying, I know you, I know somebody else, I could connect the two of you, and that connection could be mutually beneficial. So networking is very much a giving, very much a giving activity where you are helping people, connecting them with other people, connecting them with other information, connecting them with opportunities. So connection is not about just you. Connecting is doing something for the other individual.
So your definition of networking is clearly beginning with the act of giving rather than trying to figure out how do I take. So being part of different ecosystems.
That's correct. I think Adam Grant's book, Give and Take, the title really summarizes it well, because in order, if you're just a giver, you're like a sap. If you're only a taker, you're seen as selfish. It is a balance between giving and taking. It is a balance between connecting people who benefit from their connection, but also for you serving in that brokerage role, oftentimes benefit as well. There are many roles which are explicitly brokerage roles. A real estate broker connects buyers and sellers of property. An investment banker connects buyers and sellers of businesses. Companies that need capital with people with capital. Venture capitalists connect people with ideas, with people with money to invest. And so, I think brokerage is a very important function.
And what is your next rule of power?
The next rule of power is to use your power. Many people see power as something like water at glass. You drink it and it's gone. But the more you use your power, the more power you will have. You are not given a leadership role just to sit on it. You are given a leadership role to get things done. And the more things you get done, the more you use your power, the more effective you are in making organizational change and accomplishing things, the more talented people will want to work with you, and the more resources you will have. So the idea of hoarding power or sitting on it is, I think, a tremendous mistake. The more you use your power, the more power you will have.
Do you advise that leaders use their power initially to tell people that they mean business and therefore ride roughshod? Is that the way they establish power?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it ride roughshod, but Jim Collins wrote a book called Good to Great, in which he talks about getting the right people on the bus. If you're going to get the right people on the bus, that means you got to get the wrong people off the bus. We live in a very competitive, difficult world. If I'm going to succeed, I need to be surrounded by talented people who are aligned about what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. And if I either do not have the talent or the alignment, I need to do something to strategically outplace people so that I will have a better team. If I appointed you to run a failing baseball team, the first thing you would do is say, how do I improve the roster? That's the same thing you need to do in your leadership role. You need to say, how do I get the best talent? That's number one. And number two, how do I get those talents? How do I get that talent all rowing or pulling or pushing in the same direction? And that requires influence to get that done.
We often hear that the best leaders are people who are participative, who listen to others, who are the last to speak, servant leadership, etc. What's your view on that then?
Well, you should obviously listen to other people. If you talk all the time, you can't learn anything. So therefore, you obviously ought to ask people's advice. You ought to get as much information as you can from as many sources as you can. But at the end of the day, the leader is the one who is responsible for making the ultimate decisions. And so therefore, they have to be willing to take on that role and lean into it.
And the last rule of power, according to you, would be?
The last rule of power is second only in importance to the first rule. First rule is to get out of your own way. The last rule says that once you have power and influence and wealth and fame, no one will care very much about what you did to get it. They won't care if you networked your way to the top, or they won't care if you built your brand, or they won't care anything. That once you have power, essentially all, or at least most, is forgiven, forgotten, or both.
So when you think about, there are views about certain CEOs as being extremely humble, or there are, of course, an equal number of stories about CEOs who are very pompous or hard to work with. Which of them is the right balance, according to you?
Well, it depends, but on your way up, I don't think you should be so powerful. You should not be so humble. Once you're in a great position of power, you can be humble, because people will say, "Look how that powerful person! Look how powerful they are and how humble they are." Isn't that surprising?
Thank you so much for saying that. Dr. Pfeffer, this has really been like a crash course in power for the listeners, and this is particularly interesting and valuable. I want to shift gears and sort of really talk about what drew your interest to this area of research.
Well, of course, it's not the only thing I study. Throughout my career, I've tried to find topics that are important and understudied. It's kind of like if you think about the business strategy, you want to find an important need that isn't being met. In the scholarly domain, you want to find a topic which is important and that other people have shied away from. And of course, as you have nicely pointed out in the introduction to this segment of our conversation, power is a topic that does make people uncomfortable. So I often tell my class, nice people don't talk about power. Fortunately, I'm not a nice person, so I can tell you things that you need to know and need to learn about, regardless of whether or not anybody thinks they're easy to talk about or comfortable. So I think we need to talk about important topics that are understudied, under-researched, under-discussed.
When you look back at your own career, you started with Carnegie Mellon. That's where you did your undergraduation. Is that correct?
My bachelor's and master's.
And then you started to work. Tell us about that work that you did.
I graduated from college at the height of the Vietnam War. Everybody wanted a draft-deferred job. I found a job at a place called the Research Analysis Corporation, doing military manpower planning using very rudimentary methods. This was a long time ago. I mean, we ran programs on punch cards, if you can imagine back to that day, which I don't think anybody listening can. But we ran a simulation model that estimated gains and losses and accessions into the Army, and based upon that and force levels, we predicted each month how many people would need to be drafted. And so that was my job for a year, calling an assistant to General Hershey, the head of the Selective Service, and telling him how many people to draft. It was an interesting job. I was surrounded, Washington at that time was filled with highly educated people, all doing the same thing I was, trying to avoid getting sent to Vietnam and having their heads blown off. It was an interesting place to be. But however, my draft board in Tucson decided, why make a hard decision about deferment when you can make an easy decision? And the easy decision was about my flat feet. So it turns out I was physically unqualified to serve in the military, which gave me the freedom to go back and get my PhD at Stanford, which I then did.
Which of the 7 laws have you personally used in your career?
I've used there's 7 rules. And of the 7 rules of power, I have used not very many of them. And that is because my friend, the late James G. March, a very, very famous and distinguished social scientist, said once, you can have power or you can have autonomy. You cannot have both. And I have chosen to have autonomy. You see people become powerful and their schedules are no longer their own. They have assistants who control their schedules. They have enormous amount of visibility and public scrutiny. Power comes with a price. Everybody's watching everything they do. Everybody is commenting about everything they do, ranging from the cars they drive to the people they go out with, to the people they hang out with, to every kind of thing. I do not want that level of scrutiny, and I do not want anybody other than me controlling my schedule. So consequently, I've chosen autonomy over power. So I teach about power, but I myself am not that powerful.
When you look at people who are working in organizations, and of course you consulted with multiple organizations, are there departments which use power better than others and which ones don't?
Oh, well, I think human resources is a department that needs to master power. Many people go into HR because they think they want to be nice and not use power. But as a staff role, in order to get things done, you need to master power. But beyond that, I don't have generalizations. I think it really depends upon the individual leading the department and what he or she is willing and able to do. And I think it's important for a leader of a work group or a work unit to understand that if they say, well, I want to be modest and I don't want to take too much credit or whatever, that they are not only harming themselves, but they're harming the people on their team. They have a responsibility to make sure. So if your team is doing great work and getting stuff done, somebody besides you and their parents ought to know about the work of the team. So when you step back, oftentimes your team suffers as well.
I was quite amused by the comment that you made about human resources people need to understand power. Is that why so many people dislike working with human resources? Or let's not tell human resources. Is it that it attracts the wrong kind of people, or it has the right kind of people who don't understand power? Which of them is true?
I think both. I think the human resources function is a function in transition. It needs to become much more quantitative and analytical. But also, I think human resources has taken on, in many organizations, as a role of doing whatever the boss tells them to do. So if the boss says, lay off a bunch of people, we're going to lay off people, as opposed to pushing back. I think finance, if I said to you the CFO has a point of view, you wouldn't be surprised. I said if the chief marketing officer has a point of view with respect to the business, you would not be surprised. I would certainly say if the chief technology officer, the CTO, has a point of view about the technology, you would not be surprised. I think human resources also needs a point of view, and they need to advocate that point of view just as strongly as the CMO, the CTO, and the CFO advocate their points of view as well.
Terrific. I'd like to switch gears and talk about some of the other areas of your research. You've done some interesting work around the impact of work environment and well-being on people, on the employees. What drew your attention to this aspect?
Well, I wrote a book called Dying for a Paycheck. But long before I wrote Dying for a Paycheck, I noticed that I sat on the Stanford Committee for Faculty and Staff Human Resources, and we, of course, were concerned about healthcare costs. But we were concerned about healthcare costs after people were sick. In other words, we did not think very much about how to prevent people from getting ill in the first place. And as soon as you begin reading in the medical literature, you see that stress and depression are, number one, linked to each other, and stress and depression are causal of a lot of illness. People who are stressed and depressed will oftentimes engage in unhealthy behaviors like smoking, drinking, overeating, failing to exercise, etc. Stress and depression have their own direct effects on the central nervous system and therefore on people's hormones and the fundamental mechanisms of health. And so it struck me that if we were serious, which I'm not sure we were, but if we were serious about affecting healthcare and healthcare costs and the health of the population, prevention is much less expensive than remediation. And we ought to take steps to make workplaces healthier and not give people nap pods or stress reduction apps or something, like Calm cells. Instead of having stress reduction, how about stress prevention? Instead of nap pods, how about giving people jobs where they were able to get enough sleep? In other words, to do things to prevent the problems from occurring in the first place. And this is very important for human health, both behavioral health and physical health. And the two, of course, are linked.
On your website, jeffreypfeffer.com, you also have a wonderful article about this from the McKinsey consultant who talks about, mental health challenge resulting from 80 hours routinely of doing work, lack of sleep, the anxiety and stress, and resulting in a mental health breakdown. So I just thought that was extremely illuminative.
It was published actually in the McKinsey Quarterly about the relationship between behavioral health and organizational performance. I mean, hold aside the fact that when you become a leader, you are the steward of the well-being, both physical and psychological, of the people who have been entrusted to your care. Even holding that aside, if you're going to have peak performance, you need to have people in their best physical and mental condition.
You've written a lot about jobs which have no meaning. What are examples of those jobs, and what can people who are holding those jobs do about becoming less stressed about it, finding meaning in their jobs?
Every job can have meaning or the absence of meaning, depending upon how people construct meaning about their work. I mean, a janitor helps keep the place clean. People who clean in hospitals are essential for the health of the patients because germs cause disease, and therefore the eradication of germs is a sacred task. I think you can turn any task into a sacred task in which you see yourself as helping others or helping serve a broader cause, or you can turn it into a less sacred task. I think there's this old aphorism of the story about, some guy's asked what he's doing. He said, I'm laying bricks, and the same person or a different person doing the same thing could be asked, what are you doing? I'm building a cathedral. So the meaning comes from how we see our work and our willingness to ennoble the work that we do. Everybody's doing noble work.
So in some sense, is that like creating a placebo effect? If your work is very stressful, if it is meaningless, are you suggesting we also create something like a placebo to just downplay that, or do we reframe it?
Well, I think reframing it is one, but also my sense is that if your work is stressful, I tell people all the time, if you were in a room that's filling up with smoke, what would you do? You'd leave the room. If you're in a place where you're not being appreciated for what you're doing, where you're given excessive demands, where you're facing economic insecurity, where you're not able to balance your responsibilities to your family and your job, you need to get out.
But that in today's world, that's pretty much most of the jobs, isn't it? I mean, people are overworked. People are, they have very little time for the family. They have less flexibility over their time. You are attending to meetings and phone calls and emails practically throughout the day. So how does one deal with that? I mean, creating those boundaries, sometimes everybody else is following those norms. How do you deal with it?
Well, you need to understand that if you win the rat race and find yourself dead, you're just a dead rat. First of all, there are organizations that understand the connection between physical and behavioral health and performance, of which there is, by the way, a ton of research, even though the relationship is also simply common sense, and treat people better and take better care of people and are better stewards of the social environment, as there are companies that are better stewards of the physical environment. I mean, there was a time in which we permitted organizations to put crap into the air, water, and ground, and, then we figured out that it was cheaper to prevent pollution than it was to clean it up. And then we increasingly now emphasize companies' social responsibility. Well, if they have a social responsibility to the physical environment, they should also have a social responsibility to the human environment, to the carbon life forms that they're responsible for, the people who work for them.
You've also written a lot about evidence-based management. What are places where traditional management is wrong and those practices still persist? Give me some examples of that.
Oh my God, there are many. Most management overemphasizes pay. And they think because it's easy to change the pay system, I want you to do something. The quickest thing I can do is reward you or pay you for doing it. That, of course, drives out intrinsic motivation. And often we are not clever enough to design systems to take into account every little contingency. I can recall I have a dear friend named Bob Beck, who was the head of human resources, actually, for the Bank of America in the 1980s, when the Bank of America had all kinds of troubles with their foreign loans. And his CEO, Dick Clausen, said, Bob, why are we having these problems? He said, well, Dick, he said, you've given everybody big incentives to make loans, but there's no incentives to pay them back. That, by the way, was the mortgage crisis as well. You had mortgage brokers who were getting huge incentives to make mortgages, but you didn't necessarily give them the right incentives to make mortgages that actually had some chance of being paid back. I think the overemphasis on pay is a thing inconsistent with the evidence. That's one of my favorite examples, but there are many instances in which we do not really pay attention to what the social science research says about what is the best thing to do and how to manage. Forced choice ranking would be another one. The rank-and-yank system made famous by the late Jack Welch in General Electric. It's a great system as long as you don't want people to collaborate, cooperate, or share knowledge, because if I'm at risk of, we're always in competition for, who's on top, why would I share knowledge with anybody? And the answer is, of course, you don't.
Isn't that contradicting what you said about laws of power, that if you want to be powerful, you do stuff to be ahead of the others. And when you are ahead of others, you get recognized. So how do you balance both of them?
Well, what's good for the individual and what's good for the organization are oftentimes two different things. They're not always consistent. As a matter of fact, they're seldom consistent.
Which one should I choose if I had to make a choice between the two?
It depends upon what you want to do. Depends upon what you're interested in. Stan O'Neill presided over the demise of Merrill Lynch. He left with a severance package of $160 million. Did he do a good job with Merrill Lynch for the financial crisis? Probably not. He did a very good job for Mr. and Mrs. O'Neill. I don't tell people what to do. I do not offer prescriptions. I'm not a moral philosopher. I'm not a preacher of any religion. I try to tell people the rules of the world and let them decide for themselves how they want to use those rules to change lives, change organizations, change the world, including changing their own lives.
So what creates this knowing-doing gap? You know that this is how it is supposed to be done, and yet we don't do it. We are either hesitant or we don't do it early enough. What is your experience of that?
Well, I think fear makes people reluctant to act on their knowledge. I think the idea that, we're going to do what everybody else does. We're going to engage in casual benchmarking. We do what other people do and we do what other companies do because it seems safe. Layoffs, I think, is an example of social contagion. One company does layoffs, everybody else does layoffs. How can I be criticized for laying off? Everybody's doing layoffs. So I think that's another source of the knowing-doing gap. I think in many organizations, talk substitutes for action. So you see large, elaborate presentations, lots of meetings. Nobody ever asks, are we actually doing anything? So that's a third cause of the knowing-doing gap. And I think a fundamental cause of the knowing-doing gap is that there are too many people who don't do enough. If you're going to go to medical school, when you start medical school, you don't know anything. But nonetheless, someday you have to do surgery, you have to cut, you have to dissect, you have to do stuff. In medicine, the theory is see one, do one, teach one. You see it, you do it, you teach it. You learn by teaching and you learn by doing. And that's, in fact, how you improve your skill. You cannot become a better golfer, a better cricket player, or a better tennis player by reading books. At some point, you have to practice. So to the extent that more senior leaders actually did, there would be less of a knowing-doing gap.
Another place where in my work, I experience this a lot. We all know that, you need to keep updating yourself, and every organization says people are our most important assets. You need to pay for skills. We need to keep learning. Continuous learning is one of those cliches that, I'm a lifelong learner. Then yet, when you look at it, most people don't actually go on to update their knowledge base or their skills or challenge their assumptions.
It's worse than that. Every organization claims to want to be a learning organization. But learning means you're doing something that you're not a master at. Because if you were a master at it, you wouldn't need to learn it. You'd already know it. You'd already know it. But many organizations say, I don't want to afford the opportunity to give you time to learn and master new skills. I would rather hire rather than make talent. And so you see all of this external executive recruiting going on in which we buy rather than make. Because making, we think, takes too long for people to learn new things. So buying, by the way, also has its own risks.
Because when you buy talent, one of the biggest challenges is that, people take a long time to figure out the organization's culture, and which is why very few people actually succeed. External hires, very few of them succeed because the internal mechanisms gang up to make that hire fail. So barely 25%, that's the number that I am aware of people succeed.
No, that's right. And I think when you hire someone from outside, it's very hard to good due diligence on what they are and how they're actually going to perform and what their skills actually are. Many people are very good at producing resumes. At the end of the day, they actually have to be able to do the work.
You've also written extensively about the relationship of time and money. Can you demystify this relationship? How can employers use it? That's where I want to go with this.
The research on time money shows that when you think about time as money, you misinvest your time. You're more willing to do more work for pay. Money is a fungible asset. Time is not. When there are only 24 hours in a day. When the day is gone, it is over. And so jobs that cause you to to associate time with money, I think are jobs that in general cause people to make decisions not to volunteer their time, because that is, of course, working without pay. That's what volunteering is by definition. The relationship between time and money tends to have people judge their happiness in their job much more more on the basis of what they're paid than on other things. It tends to reduce the extent to which they volunteer their time, which we know is a source of enjoyment. It causes them to commodify their lives. And thinking of yourself and your time as a commodity is not something that's going to be prone to bring you a great deal of joy or happiness.
To think about applying this would be that so many organizations actually offer people just 2 weeks of paid leave instead of that paid vacation time being 2 weeks. Wouldn't it make greater sense to say that this is how much we spend entirely on this person's increments and costs and stock options and all of that, to monetize it and say, okay, we'll give you a half day off every day of the week, additional half day off. Wouldn't that be better?
Some companies, at least in the U.S., are offering people unlimited vacation. So, of course, that winds up with them actually taking less vacation because they feel guilty doing it. I think that to the extent that you give people flexibility in what they do, flexibility in terms, in other words, I give you a goal, but you figure out how to achieve it and you figure out when you want to work on it. If you want to work on it at 3 a.m, that's fine, or whatever. Again, to provide people more flexibility, because one of the big problems in life these days, particularly in almost every advanced industrialized country, the birth rate is below replacement level. And that is because when people have to make a choice between having children and having a job, they will mostly choose a job. And so you have to have what my friend Nuria Chinchilla at ESA calls work-family conciliation. You have to make it possible for people to both have a job and also successfully manage their other family responsibilities. So you need to have work-family accommodations. And you need to, we need to do many things to make work less toxic and less stressful. That's only one.
Beyond financial metrics, then what are ways in which we can evaluate people's contributions? That's been another fabulous area of your work and research.
My friend Bob Chapman, who wrote a book called Everybody Matters, says at the end of the day, do the people who are working with you and for you go home either drained and stressed and depressed, or do they go home actually at the end of the workday feeling better than when they arrived? That, to me, would be an interesting test of leaders and leadership. Do the people who work with and for you feel better having had done that experience than they did before? I hope my students feel better at the end of my class than they did before. Sometimes they feel a little depressed when you describe to them how the world works. But at the end, I think actually it's one of the reasons why my class is so popular. I teach them about power, but in the process of teaching them about power, they become empowered.
If you had to think about the role of higher education, we are sort of really looking at a lot of employers, especially in tech, who are waiving off, not just tech, but also hotels and multiple employers who are waiving off the 4-year degree requirement and sort of saying that, okay, we'll teach you for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it is, and give you jobs which give them better starting salaries than what many other jobs do. So there is one trend that which is about that we are breaking work into tasks, and therefore degrees are exploding, and sort of we are looking at micro-credentials. What do you think that is going to do to higher education?
I don't know. It depends upon where you sit in the higher education ecosystem. I mean, people come to Stanford for the credential, and they come to Stanford to meet people, to network, and they come to Stanford to learn. And you can take away the learning, but you will not take away the experience and the networking. And so, I'm not sure that I'm sure that higher education, elite higher education, will always have a future because of its credentialing mechanism. IIM, IIT in India, there's a distinction from having graduated from there, from getting into there, and that distinction will always exist. And in any event, I don't worry too much about the future of higher education. I don't know if you know this, but except I believe for the Catholic Church, universities are the second oldest institution. Yeah, so I'm not too worried.
But a lot of times we've seen that organizations which are the sole institutions have structural challenges that make it hard for them to respond to the changing market. Do you think universities and institutions of higher education will suffer from that challenge?
Well, I hope universities don't respond to the changing market. I think, one of the things I've said about Stanford sometimes is that we're a hedge fund pretending to be an educational institution. I think the financialization of life, the financialization of healthcare has been bad for U.S. healthcare. I think the financialization of higher education, where universities are worried only basically about maximizing their endowments and their revenue streams, I think has not been been good for universities. I think universities have lost their souls. I think, many professions have lost their souls. I would hope that universities would worry about some purposes besides maximizing how many dollars come in the door.
From the point of view of the student, they take on an enormous debt when they come in and sort of do this $250,000 investment. They give up. And yet you also have this trend that some individuals take their admission into, say, an Ivy League college, whether it's Harvard, Stanford, or whatever, and then they flash it around in Silicon Valley and they get the same job without having made that investment of $250,000. So as long as you clear the entrance exam and get admission, you can get almost 95% of the same salary. So what is your advice to them?
My advice to them is to go to school. By the way, we have a program at Stanford called the Master of Science and Management program. It used to be called the Sloan program, in which we have very successful people, some of whom have made a fair amount of money, who come back to learn. They come back because they actually love the academic environment. Another thing at Stanford that we have is called the Distinguished Careers Institute, which is basically people towards the end of their career who've made a ton of money, who come, they don't even get a degree, but they come to spend a year and then maybe 2 years at Stanford just learning and talking to people and rebuilding their social network. There's more to life than money. And in fact, the purpose of my research on time and money is to show that time does not equal money and money does not equal time.
Absolutely. I've heard people say time is money, but overtime is more money, and they are wrong. Thank you so very much. We are at the hour, and it's been such a delight, and it's been so very, very educational for me to hear this stuff from you with so much of clarity. I can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom with my audience. And I, of course, have shared your Twitter bio and your LinkedIn page. I look forward to people joining you there and following you and learning from you on a continuous basis. Thank you so much for being here.